Hello, and welcome back. I'm so glad that you had decided to join me again. I just appreciate people that want to spend a little bit of time with me, and I hope that what I'm doing here is informative and entertaining, because it's important. If we're going to get educated, we got to have fun and we got to be entertained. And so welcome back, as I said. What are we going to talk about today? Well, I wanted to set a kind of a base before I get further into videos, and so we're all on kind of the same page of understanding. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I thought today we could talk about volts, amps, ohms, and watts. I'm not going to get into it in too much detail. I don't want to overwhelm anyone, but these are all terms that you're going to hear if you become an owner of a BEV, or a battery electric vehicle. And so I thought, why don't I share what I know? I teach this, and so I thought I would give you some of my impressions and what I've learned. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started, and we'll see what we can learn from Amos and spend some time together. Now, I was fortunate enough to be able to purchase some new equipment, so I am now using a new camera, and hopefully it is an improved experience. As my daughter told me yesterday, the sound was terrible. So hopefully you're enjoying the sound a little bit better. So where are we at? We are in my 2022 Model Y Performance, and its name is Amos, A-M-O-S. And if anybody is a sci-fi fan like I am and has watched the excellent show The Expanse, you'll know where I get the name from. You want to keep your head above the churn, as Amos says, and I always appreciated him as a character. Our previous car to this was a Standard Range Plus Model 3, and we named it TARDIS, after the time machine from Doctor Who. So that was a fun car. As you can see, we're sci-fi fans, and I hope some of you are as well, and you get a kick out of our naming. So how am I going to do this lesson today? Well, we're going to use one of the features that the Tesla has in the toy box, which is known as Sketchpad. Now, this is a really cool feature. It's fun for kids if you're waiting while you're charging, or in this instance, if you want to make some YouTube videos. So I got it pulled up here, and we're going to go to Sketch On. And I'm going to use this to help me illustrate the points I'm trying to make today when we talk about these four terms: volts, amps, resistance, and watts. They can be a bit intimidating, and that's not the intention of this video. I don't want anybody to be intimidated. In fact, afterwards, I hope you're going to feel much more comfortable about these terms. So let's get started. One of the first terms you've probably heard of is volts. And volts can be represented typically by a V, or often you'll see them represented as an E as well. And what does that E stand for? That E stands for what's known as electromotive force. And it was an oldie time term. Essentially, when we talk about volts, we're talking about potential energy. We're talking about the potential ability for our electrons to do work. Okay, so volts is our first term, oftentimes represented by a V or an E for electromotive force. Next we have amps. And amps is often represented by an A, or you will see it as an I. And what does that I represent? It represents intensity. Again, an older time term that was come up in the early days when they were experimenting with electricity. Amps are our flow. When we talk about electrical circuits, the amps is the actual flow through our wires. So we've got volts, which is our potential energy. We have amps, or amperage, which is our flow. And then last, well, not last, but second to last, we have what's known as resistance. Okay, I'm not going to write the whole thing. And resistance is oftentimes shown with this funny little symbol, or it can be an O again for ohms. So we have resistance. Here's our symbol for resistance, and we can oftentimes we might see an O or an OHM. And what is resistance? Well, it's just what it sounds like. Resistance is the portion of our electrical circuit that resists the flow, or the intensity or current, of our potential energy, our voltage. So when we put all three of these together, resistance, voltage, and current, we get a really cool thing that's known as Ohm's law, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment. But again, I want to relate back resistance. When we think about resistance, what do we think about? We think about conductors and insulators typically. Copper wire, gold, silver, most metals are good conductors. And that means that they have very little resistance in comparison to things known as insulators, things like glass or water. Very, very clean water. Very, 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 very clean water is an excellent insulator. Dirty water, not so much. The contaminants make it conductive, so I apologize there. But when we talk about things that are non-conductive, again, glass, rubber, things like that we know as insulators, those have a very high resistance, and so it's very hard for the electrons to move through them. Resistance is also what creates our heat. The interplay between current and resistance creates our heat, and heat is what essentially is the biggest enemy of a good electrical system, or really any good mechanical system. Heat is oftentimes inefficiency. We're wasting energy as heat, and in this instance, that's our resistance interplaying with our amperage. All right, so we've discussed the three primary terms that we often hear: voltage, which is a potential energy; amperage, which is our flow in our wiring; and then resistance, which is just what it sounds like, the resistance of that flow in our wire. So how do we put those all together? Well, I'm going to show you a quick, neat little trick. Again, I don't want this to be overly complicated or too terribly long, but we can do this cool thing known as an algebraic pyramid. And if I put in my three items that we've been discussing: voltage on top, represented by the E for electromotive force; current, represented by an I for intensity; and resistance, represented by an R, or this cool little symbol here, as ohms. Now, why do I show you this? Well, because it's a handy trick that I show my students. With this, we can solve any one of those three quantities if we know the other two. So, for instance, if I was wondering what the resistance of a circuit was, I would just cover up the resistance, and I would see, oh, if I take and divide my voltage by my amps, I get my resistance. If I cover up my amperage, then if I divide my voltage by my resistance, I get my current. And if I cover up my voltage and I multiply I times R, intensity times resistance, I get a voltage. So it's a very handy trick to find an answer at any one of those three if you know two of them. Lastly, we talk about, and you'll oftentimes hear about watts. Watts is the end product, or the work that is happening between those three items that we just discussed. Voltage and current are working together, and resistance is kind of fighting against them. So what is wattage? Wattage is volts, also can be known as electromotive force, times amps. Voltage times amps gives you watts, and that's your work. Now you might say, well, Ryan, why do we care about that? Well, because when you often hear us talking, we will talk about things like watt hour per mile when we discuss how efficient these vehicles are. And so we need to be able to put that into context. So first you need to understand what a watt is, and now let's understand what a watt hour is. Well, a watt hour is simply 1 watt over an hour's time. And that's a little bit hard maybe to picture. So let's try and think about it like this. Everybody has seen 60-watt light bulbs. Everybody should be familiar with 60-watt light bulbs. And if you had 5 60-watt light bulbs, that would be 300 watts. And if you let those 5 light bulbs burn for 1 hour, well, guess what? You just have 300 watt hours. So the equivalent of the energy used by this car when it is operating in an efficient mode, it's rated at 303 miles at 300 watt hours a mile usage. Well, guess what? That's like using 5 60-watt light bulbs for an hour. One other good comparison that I like to make, so we had a nice discussion there, is you'll hear the term kilowatts. Kilowatts, kW. And what's kilowatts? Well, kilo is simply 1,000. So when you hear kilowatt, we're talking about 1,000 watts. So if I were to say 1.2 kW or 1.2 kilowatts, that would be the equivalent of 1,200 watts. And you might ask yourself, well, I don't know what 1,200 watts looks like. What is he even talking about? You do know what 1,200 watts look like. The microwave in most kitchens, newer microwaves, are going to be in the 1,000 to 1,200 watt variety. So guess what? If you're using your microwave to make that delicious bag of popcorn, you're likely using 1.2 kilowatts or 1,200 watts. And what does that equivocate to after all of this information that I shared with you? Well, most standard households are 120 volt at the receptacles or outlets. If you take 10 amps, remember our Ohm's law, if we take 120 times 10 amps, guess what? There's our 1,200 watts or 1.2 kW. So hopefully you found. Welcome back. I just wanted to give everyone a quick visual to kind of tie in what we've been talking about. And I apologize, I am not a fantastic artist, but hopefully you get the gist. You'll have to suffer along with my students. In fact, this might be a little more art than they get sometimes. So what do we have here? Well, again, I'm using Sketchpad, and we've just been going over volts, amps, resistance or ohms, and wattage. And so what I wanted to give you here is just kind of a little bit of a visual representation of volts, amps, and resistance. And hopefully this makes sense. So what I've drawn for you here on the left-hand side is a water tank. Imagine we've got our long, tall legs here with our tank on the top. And our water tank is just what it sounds like. It's filled with water. And I've put a V up there on our water tank to represent volts. The water stored in a high water tank has potential energy, the same as a battery that is sitting with nothing connected to it that's fully charged. So you can think kind of about a water tank on a hill or up on stilts, similar to the potential that is in a battery. Now, what do we need to do? Well, we've got to get that potential energy out, whether we get it out of this water tank or, in the case of your BEV, out of the battery that's connected to the motors. Because right now, all the voltage is a potential. It can do something. But you know what? Just like water, electrons want to find a neutral point. They want to get to a place where they can relax and go, ah, thank you. I no longer have all of this high potential. Now I've gotten to go and relax. So how do we let them relax? Well, in the case of our water tank, I've drawn a valve here with a really kind of terrible handle. But in the case of our battery electrical vehicle, our BEVs or our EVs, we're going to use what's known as contactors or switches or relays. It's an electrical valve. It opens just like our water valve here does, or in the instance of a contactor, closes. And when we do that, when we open our valve here on our water tank, now we are releasing our potential energy. And our potential energy is now able to flow. And there's our I, right? Our I, or A for amps, or intensity. Now we've opened that. Our potential energy has been released, and it's able to flow. And so that would be, that flow of water would be the equivalent of the flow of our electrons. So now we've released our potential energy. It's flowing. That's our intensity or our amperage. But you say, well, Ryan, what about our resistance? And also, how is our flow getting anywhere? Well, I've drawn a really terrible pipe. And the pipe in a water system is what allows that flow to travel. And if you notice, in this section of my drawing, the pipe is very wide. Well, just like in a water system, this is low resistance. Wide pipe means we can get much more flow through it, not as much resistance. But if we come down here to our area where the pipe narrows, well, guess what? We're going to have more contact. We're going to have more resistance to our flow of water. And that same is true with electrons. If we have a big, fat, heavy wire made of copper, something the size of my thumb or even bigger, we're going to get a lot of flow, low resistance, low heating. But if we start to go through a smaller pipe or a small wire, something that is going to constrict our flow, now we've got higher resistance. And what happens, folks? Well, as our resistance increases or our current, we get more heating. And as we've learned, heating is the killer of our efficiency. As things get hot, we start to lose efficiency, and we don't want to see that happen. We'll clear my beautiful drawing out, and I would just share one more quick little formula with you that relates to heat. You're going to hear it mentioned, and that is I squared R. And what does this equal? That also equals watts, folks. And you're going to notice now why we have such an issue with heating. We have to be careful, right? We've got a intensity squared times resistance. So as our amperage or our resistance goes up, guess what? So does our watts. And as our watts go up or go down, our efficiency can get killed. So hopefully this little visual helped you. We're going to be wrapping up the video, and I'll see you on the other side. I found this informative and not crazy complicated, but I wanted to show you some terms, a little bit of math that we use when we talk about these things, and hopefully make you feel slightly more comfortable with your battery electric vehicle. I appreciate you spending time with me. I'm going to continue to work on improving my delivery and my equipment, but I just want you to know that I'm having a great time. I hope you're having a good time, and let's just have more fun together. So with that, why don't you have a wonderful day, and I hope that you would like and subscribe and share this with your friends if you found it informative. I will continue to make more, and if there's anything that you need me to talk about or I didn't cover in the amount of depth you would like, leave that in the comments. Thank you and have a wonderful day.